what are some of the specific examples of fraud, Fiona, and how are these incidents typically discovered?
Yeah, so if we look at businesses, so of that 130 billion I just mentioned, 65% of that is targeted at businesses, and actually 50 billion relates to internal fraud. So let's look at some specific examples. So one that I saw a lot of was actually invoice fraud. And if people aren't sure of what invoice fraud is, this is when a fraudster will impersonate one of your customers or suppliers, and they will just create a copy of an invoice. And all they will do, very simply, is change the account number and sort code. So you think your invoice is from a known person or a known company, so potentially you don't ask any further questions and you just send the funds. So you need to start thinking about how would you prevent this. Joe, have I paid this supplier previously? Well, yes, you probably have, because you've got the invoice and it's a copy of an invoice. Are they the usual payment details? And actually, a big part of this is knowing, does it look suspicious? So do I normally send £10,000 to this supplier, but all of a sudden I've got an invoice for £100,000? You might think, oh, it will never happen to me. And I know many customers saying, oh, yeah, won't happen to me. But nobody's exempt from this. And in fact, quite recently, Amazon were victims of an invoice fraud of up to about £19 million. Also, another well-known company lost 600,000, received an invoice from a fraudster. And what they'd also done is actually copied the email address and just made one slight change. On the face of it, all looked very legitimate, but no, it was actually fraudulent.
Wow. And I know I did listen to a report on BBC Radio 4 recently where a business had £1.6 million stolen. Unfortunately, the financial controller had unwittingly given access to the company's bank account. He thought he was actually dealing with his bank, and they'd told him that the funds were under threat, and they transferred about £1.6 million out over the space of 20 minutes, and that money's now gone forever.
Yeah. And that actually links to another fraud type, impersonator fraud. And I was actually targeted personally in my previous role because I had a discretion to sign off payments for customers up to tens of millions. And I received an email asking me to authorize the payment. Now, the payment request came from an internal email, so looked like it was a member of bank staff, and all looked fine, and it was nothing out of the ordinary. The only reason I was suspicious was the wording on the email, because it was quite formal and quite polite. And let's just say the person who they were impersonating didn't usually have that tone. So it just made me super suspicious. So when I looked at the email address, there was one minor difference where they'd literally just added a full stop in. So being vigilant and ultimately trusting my instincts, the fraud was avoided. But what was clever was the fraudster must have known about bank internal processes, because they knew who to target for the authorization. It was either that, or they just took a lucky guess and maybe got my information from somewhere online, maybe LinkedIn or something.
Yeah, and I've also read about email hacks where loan correspondence was altered to update bank details and request the company to start making loan repayments to a different bank account. Yeah. And again, I think it was really a follow-up call to the finance company to confirm these details that revealed that letter was completely fraudulent, and luckily that particular fraud was avoided.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about internal fraud, Fiona? That's interesting. How were these incidents typically discovered and resolved?
Yeah. So looking back at that, what I just talked about, where I was targeted, so that actually could have been an internal fraud because they did know the internal bank processes. I'll never know. But when you look at it, internal fraud is actually the one that is escalating and is growing year on year. And actually, when you start to look at internal fraud, yes, you've got the financial impact because there's a fraud there. But but it goes beyond that, because then you have obviously your staff costs, so disciplinaries, replacing the member of staff, absences, reputational damage, staff morale. So internal fraud is a big one, and it will look very different for different companies, well, depending on what you do.